On today's World Insight, on the eve of a summit between the presidents of China and the U.S., what's the state of relations between the world's top economies? The most pressing matters. Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. This is a live show on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet with U.S. President Joe Biden via video link on Tuesday morning, Beijing time. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said the two presidents will exchange views on ties and issues of mutual concern. The summit is a chance for both leaders to cooperate on global issues and put relations back on track. Before we get down to a discussion about it, let's take a look at this.
The highly anticipated talk will be the third engagement between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Joe Biden since the U.S. president took office in January. The talk will happen days after both countries issued a surprise statement of cooperation on climate change at the COP26 in Glasgow, both pledging to speed up action in reining in greenhouse gas emissions. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson stressed the summit's importance not only to bilateral ties, but also international relations.
We hope the U.S. and China will meet each other in halfway by enhancing dialogue and cooperation, effectively managing conflicts, and appropriately handling sensitive issues. We hope the two countries will explore ways of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence and push China-U.S. relations back on the right track.
The two sides have had some high-level talks earlier this year, including the phone conversation between the presidents in September, which is a, quote, candid, in-depth, and extensive strategic communication and exchanges. And there are also some ministerial meetings. The first face-to-face meeting between top Chinese and U.S. diplomats in Alaska this March opened with a heated exchange. Then in July, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman met in Tianjin. In October, the Director of the Office of the Foreign Affairs Commission of the CPC Central Committee, Yang Jiechi, and the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met in Zurich. Also in October, Wang Yi met with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Rome on the sidelines of the G20 World Leaders Summit. As the two largest economies in the world, both China and the U.S. are weathering some domestic issues, like the sixth plenary session of the 19th CPC Central Committee, charting China's future development as well as the control of inflation and the pandemic in the U.S. This upcoming meeting between the two leaders is expected to be an equal, mutually beneficial exchange that could put relations back on track.
Yes, on the relations between China and the U.S. and the upcoming U.S.-China President's meeting, we are joined by three panelists. Michael O'Halloran, Senior Fellow with the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence and Director of the Research for Foreign Policy with the Brookings Institution. Good to see you, sir. Long time no see, I have to say. In Memphis, Dr.
Nice to be back.
Good to see you. Dr. Joseph Gregory Mahoney, a professor of politics at East China Normal University. Good to see you as well, sir. Last but not least, in Shanghai, Shending Li, a professor with the Institute of International Studies of Fudan University. Professor Shen, good to see you. So, a lot of attention on this meeting. Nobody is expecting it's going to achieve a miracle, but certainly people are pinning some hope on it. But how much, Mr. O'Halloran?
Well, I think you summarized it correctly. We should have lots of pragmatic, low-key conversations and meetings. I liked very much the setup package that underscored the number of times there have already been high-level meetings and also conversations between President Xi and President Biden. I like the fact that your colleague pointed out that the meeting in March was not always that easy. and there were some heated exchanges. I would rather see a lot of realistic dialogue where there are differences of opinion that are articulated, and there's no happy talk. There's no pretense that somehow we can rescue the entire relationship with one chummy phone call or a visit to the Olympics or something like that, but rather that we continue to focus on those issues that are the most difficult and the most dangerous, including, for example, the fraud issue of Taiwan, but also issues of intellectual property rights, also issues of collaboration and economic development around the world. So I like this kind of a pragmatic, business-like conversation.
I see. Business-like conversation. What should be on that laundry list? Since Mr. O'Hanlon already given his, what about for you, Professor Shen from China?
Well, I agree with Michael that we may not play high hope for the outcome of the meeting. But I do have my personal hope the meeting would start more meeting, not necessary to start a good relationship, but at least to reduce the damage, to control the damage, to prevent more damage from happening. And this is more likely through the talk than without the talk.
All right, so that's damage control and prevention of further damage. Is that going to be the assessment, Mr. Mahoney, that you can give to the upcoming meeting?
I'm a little optimistic, although I'll temper it somewhat. With the COP26 emissions deal that we saw, the surprise deal we saw between the U.S. and China, given the fact that I think U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai sort of opened the possibility that we'd see some resolution on trade this year, and the simple fact that we're having a summit, I don't think that President Xi would agree to participate in a summit that wasn't going to produce some positive, tangible results. I don't think he's interested in the sort of posturing that we saw between Biden and Putin earlier this year. So I think that we're going to see some positive movement on trade at least, and probably not much else, maybe a little bit on technology.
Well, we'll see. Since you talk about the COP26, let's take a look at what kind of foundation can they lay, at least good feelings can they lay for the two presidents meeting. In a surprise quote-unquote announcement at the COP26 summit in Glasgow, China and the U.S. Have agreed to do more jointly on the climate change issue. The world's two largest economies called for establishing a working group in carrying out the Paris Agreement, which seeks to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. China and the U.S. have also agreed to improve policies on balancing electricity supply and demand, and also on pursuing solar storage and other clean power solutions. They have also been agreeing to work together in cutting methane emissions. The two sides have made amid these promises, amid the tensions over trade, human rights, and geopolitical issues. So you can see there is a lot on the agenda, but how much, Professor Shen, do you think this is really helping to create a good atmosphere?
Yes. Actually, the bottom line is to control damage. But what if more than control damage, the two presidents can achieve more positive outcome? For instance, President Xi Jinping spoke to the UN General Assembly this year by stating China commits not to build more coal-burning power station outside of China. And this would help not only China can reach a carbon emission peak by 2030. China would not contribute to more carbon emissions through its own building up of those coal-burning kind of electricity generation power. And also the U.S. seems to push China, what if China can advance the target year 2030 to 2029, 2028, China would reach carbon emission peak. China has not agreed. China says, you cannot expect me to cooperate while you push me on Xinjiang, Taiwan, South China Sea, and Hong Kong. But China does release the statement with the U.S. in Glasgow on strengthening bilateral cooperation on carbon reduction by stating, it seems to me that China has stated from 2025, China would start to reduce the coal burning inside China.
Okay.
And that must help China to achieve the carbon emission peak before 2030.
This is a
That's
very
the cooperation.
This is a very interesting example, Mr. O'Hanlon. Of course, you're a security expert, but looking at this case study in a way that China certainly is not going to make the commitment with the pressure coming from Washington, but China is willing to make a commitment on its own initiative. So this is a very interesting example. And on that initiative, China and U.S. can work together. This brings us to really a long-time discussion since earlier this year about the so-called the position of strength, which is a phrase being debated between China and the United States for such a long time. So Mr. O'Hanlon, tell me more about from what kinds of basis do you think the two presidents should talk to each other so that they can at least guarantee some success?
Well, you know, I like the way Ding Li put it, but I guess one example I would give, just in terms of the overall takeaway for both countries and their publics, is to remind people that these are two serious countries that are trying to make the world better, first and foremost for their own people, but also for everyone on the planet. And that's different from, let's say, Stalin's Soviet Union. That's certainly different from aggressive powers in Europe before and during the world wars. I think China and the United States actually have mutual respect and do have more mutual interests than they have mutual differences. And in fact, I believe it's important to keep sending that message to our publics, because sometimes other messages get sent. For example, I'll be critical of my own government here. As you'll recall, both the Trump and the Biden administrations have accused China of genocide towards the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province. I would criticize China for some of its policies there, but they're not genocide. And that's a very dangerous and loaded term to use. We don't want to demonize each other. We want to remember that both countries are trying to be serious about the way they govern. They may have different perspectives, different values to some extent, but they're both trying to improve the lives of their own people, and they're trying to do it in a generally collaborative way. We have to keep sending that message because we don't want images of demonization to dominate either side's view of the other.
Point taken, Professor Shen. Of course, even on the issue of the treatment of Uyghurs and the minorities, there are different understandings about China's practices, and China has some work to do to communicate with the rest of the world about that. But one thing is for sure, there has been a lot of misconceptions, sometimes even man-made misperceptions being created outside China toward China. So, Professor Shen, to what extent, once again, going back to the meeting between the two presidents, that they should be able to communicate despite of opinion differences, so that they can guarantee to lay some foundation for further discussions which will do good for both countries and certainly for the rest of the world as well?
Recently, Mr. John Thornton, who has founded the Thornton Center for China Study at Brookings, has visited Xinjiang. Even though the White House was unhappy for his visit, but he insisted that he want to visit. I think that's very good. Through on-site visit, he may understand better that China has room to improve its action to strike against those radical force, those pro-terrorist force. But China's action cannot be described in any sense by the term that genocide that Michael has stated. There is no such a thing of genocide, but China's action can be improved. So this is the thing the two countries should improve their communication. China should not only tell, I'm not doing that. China should also invite more American friends to Xinjiang to have the on-site visit and to facilitate their visitation. And meantime, America need to speak more seriously without on-site visit. When you only hear some Uyghurs to speaking around to demonize China, this cannot be taken as a serious evidence. So both U.S. and China need to communicate better, and the two presidents can do this for their video phone call.
Well, so once again, this is another interesting case study about how much the two sides should communicate with one another from their different perspectives, but at the same time not being bogged down in this meeting by one issue, because there are many other issues that the two sides have to handle. You know, our conversation, mini conversation taking place here is in a way reflecting the challenges of communication, but the necessities of communication as well. Professor Mahoney, tell me more about trade issues. You earlier suggested at least some progress can be made in that regard. Why are you so confident? About the tariffs?
Yeah, I think the key issue, I think a lot of people will of course focus on the Taiwan issue, and certainly this is a red line issue for Beijing. But I think it's really, I suspect that although Washington has several incentives to cause trouble in the Taiwan Strait, that they're really seeking leverage in trying to resolve the trade dispute. I think that the failed trade war has been catastrophic for the U.S. I think it's not the sole cause, but a significant cause of some of the inflation and shortages that we're seeing right now. And this is the next big issue that's sort of, I think, depressing Biden's approval ratings and threatening Democratic control of Congress next year and perhaps his reelection. So I think that Taiwan is kind of a leverage issue that is trying to push China into making a more favorable concession towards the U.S. in the trade war. But the thing that we have to keep in mind is that RCEP comes into force January 1, 2022. It's going to be the world's largest free trade group. And, you know, China has been working furiously over the last couple of years since Trump instigated this trade war to resolve tech bottlenecks, to create more resiliency. So I think the pressure for China to resolve this is decreasing, but it's increasing for the U.S. And that's sort of the strange contradiction or Maldun that we've reached now in this thing. But I think it opens the door for some resolution, again, as signaled by Catherine Tai earlier this year.
Well, the two presidents are to meet with one another. Catherine Tai, the trade rep from the U.S. side, is to visit different economies surrounding China. It's a very interesting gesture and a very interesting timing. Professor Shen, how do you see this? Because there has been some thoughts going on in China about how the U.S. is trying to encircling China in a way. And it is likely to be reflected also on the sideline of the two presidents' meeting.
Well, I think the U.S. trade representative can avoid China's perception that she is visiting surrounding China in order to press China. I think it's better for her to add China as a part of her Asian visit. Meantime, China could invite her if she would not initially plan to visit China. At least I think Liu He's two phone call talks with the U.S. trade representative have helped China-U.S. to ease their trade skirmish a bit. The U.S. trade representative stated that the U.S. is going to remove China from the Trump-era sanction bit by a bit. So over time, the U.S. would do more. And China say, why not do a lot at the beginning? But at least the two sides start to talk. Liu He has also talked with the U.S. American leader, Ms. Yellen, in order to talk how to stabilize the global finance. All these are positive indicators. So I venture to say the worst time for China-U.S. trade relationship has been gone. But the best has yet to come. So through the two presidents' first ever video conference, probably more and more partnership in a constructive manner would appear.
Okay, Mr. O'Halloran?
Right. I think that on trade, I would agree with Professor Maloney that the Trump tariffs have not been well constructed. And I think we should move to a different kind of approach, a different framework, and it should be fairly clear and easy to understand. One is that both sides care about their high technology assets and advantages, and we have to be careful about the sales of the highest technology capabilities to each other at a time when we are strategic competitors. So I think there you do have to be careful. General tariffs, however, don't make much sense to me unless there is some specific allegation that a given company in China or the United States is somehow being unfair, in which case you should use the tariff as a compensation, and it should be proportionate to whatever degree of unfairness you believe has taken place. Otherwise, we should try to get on with fairly robust and normal economic interaction. And the United States and its allies need to be careful, just as China probably does, not to be completely dependent on the other, because we do need diversity and resilience in our global supply chains and in our strategic relationships. But I want to get rid of the Trump tariffs myself.
It's a very interesting timing if you look at what's going on, because at the end of this month, there's going to be a ministerial meeting at the WTO. Of course, multilateral framework would also be an interesting platform for China and the U.S. to meet for some candid talks. But before that, the two presidents likely to touch on some crucial issues. Another thing I want to ask all of you is the fact that how do you see every issue in the big framework of China-U.S. relations, how they are linked with one another and how they are forming the whole picture? On the one hand, in a negotiation, of course, people use all kinds of tools and strategies in order to have an upper hand. That's totally understandable. But on the other hand, strategically, how will these issues link to one another? And how will these issues eventually form together in what structure a China-U.S. relationship? I hope I got my points clearly. Professor Mahoney, how do you see that issue briefly?
You know, I think that one of the things that concerns me is that Biden, in some respects, seems to be running two foreign policies towards China. He's kind of got two Secretary of States working for him. He's got the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, running the climate change stuff, and that's what we've seen him, Kerry, using those old relationships to basically restate the same conclusions that he reached before when he was Secretary of State with China. And then we've got Blinken that's running a much more aggressive position. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if with Blinken we've got AUKUS, we've got Indo-Pacific, we've got troops in Taiwan. So it'll be interesting to see if these things are going to continue to be a two-headed snake, or if they're going to come together and start being sort of a rational whole that can make real progress instead of constantly pulling each other apart.
Quoting the word competition, there seems to be competition already going on bureaucratically within the U.S. administration. Mr. O'Halloran, about China?
I think that's right. I think that the instincts are different, whether it's Kerry or Blinken or Sullivan. But I also would want to highlight, and we maybe should have a separate conversation on this sometime, and I know you already have, Taiwan. Taiwan is so important because to me, it's not just that there are 10 or 20 issues and you sort of somehow add them up together and that becomes the relationship. To me, Taiwan is the only issue that could lead us to war, credibly. I mean, yeah, we could wind up in an inadvertent war over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands or something like that, but Taiwan is the only issue that divides China and the United States that's big enough and important enough that you could plausibly imagine a path to war. My good friend Ding-Li Shen and I, we've been studying how to avoid nuclear war since we were graduate students together at Princeton in the 1980s. And this is the only issue that I believe could credibly threaten the risk of nuclear war between China and the United States. So obviously, it's a very hard issue to make progress on, but it has to have a special importance above and beyond the others. And I don't think it's just a matter of gaining leverage for other issues. Taiwan is, to me, the single most important issue that we need to make sure does not blow up.
How do you expect the two presidents to discuss about that? You know, what angle are they likely to get in about that issue? What are likely to be the bottom line they are going to hold on to? I mean, after all, they agreed to have a bilateral meeting.
Yeah. Well, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but just one idea that I would put forth. As you know, there is this longstanding debate in the United States about so-called strategic ambiguity. Should we commit in advance that we would militarily intervene in defense of Taiwan in a war between China and Taiwan, even though we don't recognize Taiwan as a country and do not have a treaty with Taiwan? My view is that that's sort of the wrong debate. What we should say is, listen, we have strategic clarity. If China attacks Taiwan with the intent of forcible reunification, that will change the U.S.-China relationship immeasurably. And we're not going to say now what it would be, what the changes would be, or if we intervene militarily, but it would change everything else. And all the issues we talked about today, all of them would change if there were that kind of an attack. That's one thing we could say that would begin to clarify a little bit the U.S. stance.
All right. Very interesting, the U.S. stance. Of course, China-U.S. have long had this, the issue about Taiwan as the very strategic and basic principle between China and the United States. Professor Shen, since you were all classmates with Mr. O'Halloran on the issue of how to avoid war, so tell me more about your thoughts.
On the issue of Taiwan, China is of the view, first, we have the right to handle Taiwan. Second, we want to do our utmost efforts to handle this issue through peaceful means. So China has set a very clear message. When some conditions were triggered, that would make China to employ unpeaceful means. Those conditions are Taiwan announcing de jure independence, legal independence, or some equivalent de jure independence has happened in Taiwan. And third, foreign military has landed in Taiwan. So if America would keep its word when China-U.S. established a diplomatic relationship in 1979, U.S. committed that in the future, U.S.-Taiwan relationship would be kept unofficial. And U.S. military would be completely withdrawn from Taiwan. And third, U.S. would not keep a bilateral mutual defense agreement. If U.S. would keep its commitment to China, I think the cross-Taiwan Strait stability and peace could very likely be maintained. But the question is, U.S. has sent its military transporter to land in Taiwan 4 times this year. And U.S. officials, Health Secretary Mr. Azar and Trump visited Taiwan last year. And all this made China to feel very suspicious if U.S. is still a serious superpower which commits to its own word. And that suspicion makes the China relationship to be dangerous. So while the U.S. feels China's move is dangerous, China feels similarly in other areas that the U.S. is undertaking some dangerous move.
All right.
I hope the president's meeting soon this week could help each side to alleviate their unnecessary security concern.
That's very necessary. I have to say we are running out of time for now. Thank you so much, the 3 of you gentlemen, for joining us and helping us to lighten up some of the important issues likely to be discussed during the 2 presidents. Thank you so much. Michael O'Halloran, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, and Shen-Ding Li. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Really appreciate it. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.